Everyone wants their efforts to make a difference. What happens when you connect that to a greater vision? It's called relationship or management by objective. Coming up next on 10 Tenets of Leadership. Welcome to this episode of 10 Tenets of Leadership. I'm Andy McCaskey from STR News, and we're going to be talking about management by objective. Our host, as always, Larry Pendergrass.
Thank you, Andy. And I'd like to introduce two people here today with us. Let me start with Domingo Figueredo. He is the Worldwide Reliability Manager at Avago Technologies. Domingo, I wonder if you'd say a few words about your background.
Yeah, good morning, Larry and Skip and Andy. Thank you very much for inviting me to the video conference. Yes, I actually am working today as a semiconductor reliability engineering manager, quality and reliability engineering manager for Avago. I've had the privilege of working in pretty much every continent around the planet in the last 30 years, and also had the privilege of working with you at HP. So many of these principles that we'll talk about today will be perhaps very much reflected in some of the principles that we received directly when Bill and David were around, Bill Hewlett and David Packard were around. So yeah, thank you for having me today. I appreciate that.
That's absolutely true. Great, Domingo, thank you. I'd also like to introduce Skip Rung. Skip is the president at ONAMI, the Oregon Nanoscience and Microtechnologies Institute. Would you say a few words about your background, please, Skip?
Good morning, Larry and Domingo. Nice to talk to you again after all these years. So I got engineering degrees at Stanford and then went across the street to Hewlett Packard Laboratories in 1977 and eventually ended up in Corvallis, Oregon, running the R&D for the inkjet technology. That was, of course, such a great business for HP. I became interested in university research and startup companies, particularly because I felt Oregon needed greater success there. And so that led to the birth of ONAMI in 2003. And we're kind of a cross between a research enhancement organization and an early stage VC firm focusing on technology transfer into startups.
Great, wonderful, and welcome to both of you. I'd like to start off by just introducing this tenet, and then I'd like to get your opinions about and your experiences in your work. So let me start with management by objective, and I'll give you a rough definition of that. We do have an episode on 10 Tenets of Leadership that describes this as well in some detail. So management by objective is the process by which you manage people by setting objectives rather than being too directive about exactly how they do that job. It's trying to focus on what needs to be done and not how, and giving people some degree of freedom. It is not necessarily just the focus on writing an objective for a performance evaluation period of time. That is not sufficient for what we're talking about management by objective. It really has to do with giving people the freedom that they need and desire to come up with solutions that may surprise you. So that's just a rough idea of what management by objective is here. What management by objective is here today. We will talk about this in more detail and hopefully you'll get a better understanding of it. So to start with, maybe I can turn to you, Skip, and talk to us a little bit about your experiences with this. And if you have some specific examples that would help illuminate, that would be good as well.
Well, asking me about MBO, which is what HP called it, is a little bit like asking a fish what water is like, because from the moment I walked into HP in 1977, we were told that was the way things are done. It was one of the corporate tenets. And so I didn't understand it, didn't have to understand it. That was just the way things were done. And when I became a manager in the organization, that made complete sense to me because that's the way things were done. I find it liberating in a lot of ways over many instances. in that you get your people to operate at a very high level, and that's to your great advantage. At the same time, it challenges you to actually know what your objective is and be able to communicate it, as you said, not simply for a performance evaluation, but because it's something that needs to be done. At the same time, it absolves you from having to know yourself how it's going to be done. So just about every project I ever did at HP was run that way. And just about everything I do now is, because I employ very few people and lead only by influence over, people we give grants to or make investments in.
So Skip, can you give us any specific examples, or as you said, was this more like just all the water around the fish, and it's pretty hard to describe what it is and separate it from just doing business?
Well, sure. I mean, we need a test instrument built, to measure something related to inkjet, pens. I don't know exactly how that's going to be done. So, we agree on this is what the function of this instrument needs to be, and this is when it needs to be ready for use, and this is what we're prepared to spend on it, and then that becomes an objective for the test equipment section manager or something like that who reports to me.
So it also sounds like it's assuming certainly that the manager is not always the smartest guy in the room.
Usually wasn't, in my experience.
I don't think I've ever been the smartest guy in the room. Well, maybe we can turn.
It was a long time ago.
So Domingo, maybe we can turn to you and ask you the same question. Can you give us some idea about your experiences, either pro or con, in this area?
Yeah, actually, I think that management by objective is exactly like Skip says, is really quite a liberating thing when you do it right? Because as engineers, we're trained to be very technical and to solve problems in closed form, and that implies a very, very tight level of control. But when you transition into managing by objective in particular, it really implies exactly what it says, which is you're going to delegate, and instead of controlling, you're going to use your influence, as Skip said, to try to get things done. And probably the most compelling example that I have experienced in my life has to do when you have, and I use the phrase, discovery in the critical path. So you basically have to invent something in order to deliver a product within, like Skip said, within a certain cost and a certain timeline, right? So even in that kind of situation, what I found is that you can structure the MBO in such a way that it maximizes the learning cycles that you need in order to improve the chances of creating that quote unquote invention in the middle of the critical path. So to me, even in the most ambiguous and most difficult of situations where you have result B actually impact, the plan A that you initially had, and these things are truly codependent, they really work very well because you can actually use those things to even break some of those complex codependencies that you get in very technical programs and projects.
So Domingo, who do you think really benefits from MBO?
Well, I think everyone does. I think the manager benefits because it lowers her or his stress level, right? Because of basically you're absolved from having all that total control. The other thing is the employee benefits because of, obviously you have to put the trust in the employee to do the job that you've asked them to do. And then eventually the company benefits because, let's face it, if the employee and the manager have found a job that is good for both the company and for the employee, then everybody wins, right? So I think it's all about that alignment. If you get that alignment, then everybody wins. If you don't get that alignment, then things can get very difficult and you have to make some changes.
Right, makes sense.
And if you don't have that alignment, that's a good thing to find out early, not later.
Yeah.
Exactly. Good point.
So it sounds like we're getting to some ideas about what's necessary to support the MBO kind of atmosphere. Skip, can you help us understand, when does it work? When does it not? What kind of cautions or what kind of responsibilities does a manager have?
Well, it works when you have, something that would benefit, from individual creativity and inventiveness, which was usually the case in engineering organizations. It may not work as well when, you need to staff a security guard gate and follow, some rules that ultimately have their roots, in set law. So There are some cases where it's clear to everyone. It's not an objective a manager would make up what has to be done, and there's relatively little room. In fact, a disadvantage of being creative. But where there's upside and uncertainty, MBO is the way to go.
So does that mean that an MBO in a finance department won't work because of gap?
Well, MBO in certain accounting functions probably isn't such a good idea. You know, the old joke about, you know, the accountant asking you what you want the number to be, that you probably don't want to give them that number. But in a finance operation, you know, a CFO operation, then, you know, that's obviously, you know, hugely important. You know, we need to raise, you know, this much investment money and satisfy, you know, investors and stakeholders in the company. A very different environment than complying with accounting, you know, principles that you're bound to.
Right. So you can certainly set some objectives that to follow gap as an example. You know, that might be an objective, or raise this amount of funds. Is that what I hear you saying?
Yeah.
Yeah. In those cases, MBO works.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah. So Domingo, what do you think the responsibility then is of a manager if they're trying to create an MBO atmosphere? What kind of cautions would you give people?
Well, I think the most important thing is, you know, we're all human beings, right? And the three most important things that we care about are security, acceptance, and meaning, right? So we need to be able to connect the things that we do with something meaningful. So I think the most important thing that a manager can do is to tie the individual's activity, goals, management by objective, to the greater picture that is trying to be accomplished by the entire group. And usually nobody works as an individual person. So having that picture, a vision that clearly connects what I do and it's exactly like you said, Larry, you don't necessarily need to achieve a level of granularity on the MBO that it becomes almost like management by directive instead of management by objective. But if you do a good link between the employee's goal and the company's vision, for example, in my experience, that can be very energizing, very motivating, and very changing, because sometimes you need to change the organization. And the connection to the vision, I think, in my experience, has been very powerful and very good at affecting change.
Have you ever had an experience, Domingo, in your case where you had set out to be an MBO kind of manager and you had to call a stop to it and say, we have to lay down this directive?
No, Larry, but that's a good question, because what I have found is that, for example, some of the products that we work on are basically, they may have a 6 month to a 10 months life cycle if you really look at it. And we have many of those that happen at the same time. So what happens is that the MBO may change to some extent, and so the issue becomes an issue of maintenance. The manager also has to be responsible for keeping them fresh and refreshing them depending on whatever your product life cycle or whatever your business cycle looks like. It has to be aligned.
Right,
that's my experience.
Right, makes sense. Skip, same question to you. Have you ever had an experience where you were operating in an MBO environment and something occurred along the way in a project and you had to say, you know, I have to be directive here?
Well, I mean, what we would typically encounter, you know, in inkjet is that, you know, you are operating in an MBO environment to develop a product and put it out, and then, you know, problems arise, and we will then typically we would create multifunctional task forces to solve a problem whose origin might be in the design, that might be in the process. Nobody is exactly sure. So there is an organizationally directive thing that happens then, you know, forming a task force and appointing a leader. But at that point, it's MBO again, because you don't know the solution to the problem yourself. You've assembled the best people you can, ask them to become a team and solve the problem.
Right. Yeah,
I mean, there are other things, whether it's matters of law, you know, or, you know, logistics, you know, just kind of housekeeping or hygiene stuff, you know, that isn't really related to project accomplishment, where it's directive. It needs, you know, you need to fill out the time card one way. Please don't get creative about that. It won't help.
Mm-hmm. So Skip, let's talk a little bit about how you communicate goals, set those goals, and what your responsibility is over time. You just mentioned that sometimes it's dynamic. You need to adjust those objectives based on new information. I'd like to ask, for instance, how do you know if you've set the right goal? Not one that's too hard, not one that's maybe too easy. I assume you're trying to get to a position where you're stretching your people a little bit, but help us understand how you know if you've got the right goal. How do you determine that? And then how do you communicate that? How do you work with your people?
You know, this reminds me a little bit of an article, and bear with me for a minute here. Back in probably the early 80s in Fortune, which for Business Week or something, that was always a little skeptical about HP. And the article was called Management by Whose Objective? And their whole premise was that MBO really wasn't, that a manager is giving an objective, and that's directive right there. The employees or the team really had no say in the matter, and so they're bound by it. In contrast to that, what we were taught in a piece of corporate training called the process of management is that it starts with a shared vision, and then a goal is really a shared commitment. So the idea that the goal setting flows one way is a little bit of an incorrect premise. So where it works best is where it's negotiated, and people's ideas and suggestions have informed the goal in the first place. And I always found you set better goals, more realistic goals, if you've got some buy-in and some contribution from the very beginning. So it isn't a one-way thing. On the other hand, some things are clear, and we've got our own, we managers have our own managers, or our own, in my case now, contractual commitments with the state of Oregon, where there's a negotiated goal that does have to be passed down, but then turned into lower level strategies and tactics, with the implementers. But that's a negotiation too.
That's interesting. Yeah, in my experience, MBO has been defined over the years, or maybe mislabeled in many, many different ways. I think you point out another one there where the idea, the person who's writing this article is saying, just by being directive with an objective, there you go, you're being directive. I've also heard it used for just the process of writing out your goals for the next year, that is management by objective. And I don't think any of that speaks to the spirit that you two have been describing here today. So maybe, Domingo, help us understand from your perspective, about that static or dynamic objective setting, and how you know when you've set an objective that's too hard or too soft.
Well, usually, let me start out with the first part of your question, which is how do you know that you set up the right objective? Usually, you know it because the result is greater than you could possibly imagine, usually because you've done, as Skip was saying, you've done a good handshake with the people that you're working with, and you've negotiated these goals because, in this modern day and age where we have so much competitive pressure, right, and people, get measured for their performance, right? One of the other great values of having MBOs in place that are meaningful is that you can use that to try to do this process that we're all forced to do in a management environment where you actually have to rate the performance of each and every one of your employees, right? So I know that it works when you get a result that usually I didn't expect, and it's a very pleasant one. And I know it doesn't work most of the time when you can see it very early on. The nice thing about these two options is that if you're watching carefully, you can see it very early on in the process. You can see it in the energy of your employees. You can see in the early results in the approach. And if you're listening, it's kind of like a differential process. What's working and what's not working. And you use that to adjust and manage. You may have to adjust it, just like Skip said, or it may be a situation where you don't do any of that. I've actually had to intervene in some cases and do a complete management by directive if it's a safety issue. If there's a cable in the middle of the room running across the floor, or if the machine is blocking an exit that would be legally, forbidden to be there, okay, well, that machine has to go and we have to put it someplace else. Let's go do it, and we'll do it together, kind of thing. But so I've actually had the privilege of experiencing like a whole range of when it works, when it doesn't work, and when you have to do command and control too. So.
Right. Some of the things you're describing certainly are safety issues.
Yes.
There's some things that are non-negotiable.
Right.
You simply must go forward and
environmental safety, and it doesn't have to be physical safety. It can also be the emotional quality of the environment that you're working in, because that can also be very costly too.
Right.
If you don't manage it properly. So.
Makes sense. So two things come to mind for me as we're talking here, Domingo. You just opened the question about metrics and how you measure people. That's the first thing. And we're going to have to pause there, Andy, because I just lost the second thing. Okay, so there's a little editing job.
That's okay.
Right
The
there.
other thing that I wanted to understand.
So I'd like to explore a little
Larry.
bit further, if you would, Domingo.
Say, Larry?
Yes.
Yeah, the other thing is the transition to next week. What's the next subject coming up? Do you know what that is?
Yes, it's enable your people. We don't have anybody identified to interview for that yet, but
Okay.
that's what it is.
All right. I just wanted to have that. Yeah.
Right.
Let's go ahead. I'll bring you up, and you said that there were two things. The conversation was there are two things we want to talk about.
Yeah, I'm hoping you can cut it before that, and I can just talk about one thing. Is that possible?
We could arrange that.
Okay. Let's just start with one thing,
All right.
and maybe I'll bring up the other when I remember it.
Yeah. Give me about 5 seconds of silence, okay?
All right. So Domingo, you just opened the question, I think it's a good one, about how we need to measure our people in this MBO environment. It's very clear that you still need to measure people. So if you've given them so much freedom, one question that comes to mind is, how do you measure people in this kind of environment?
Well, I think it's at least in my experience, actually fairly easy. It depends again on the quality of the MBO. When you set the MBO to begin with, if what I have found actually works really well is the process of negotiation, as both you and Skip had mentioned before. For each and every one of these MBOs, however much granularity makes sense, what I found works really well is you assign a weight to each one of them, and then you also assign a score that you can negotiate with the employee. And again, it helps with the level of detail and granularity that you want to have. And if it's a very rapidly changing environment, then that also becomes part of the MBO, is how well do we react to the change when the change does come. It's not if, but when, right? So that's my experience, is having in that negotiation at the very beginning, a clear description of the MBO, a clear description of the weight that it would carry perhaps towards a ranking, and also a score that goes along with it, which you put in, and you also negotiate at the end, makes for what I think is a very, very good handshake.
Right. Yeah, and yet that just doing that one measure aspect, measuring your people, even if it's as a well-honed an algorithm as that, that's not exclusive. That's not in and of itself MBO. Is that correct?
That's correct. It's not itself an MBO. It's part of a process. It's one of the things that certainly you can use MBOs for. There's no question about that. But I was just thinking, the reason that I mentioned it is because I've actually had the chance to use it from the very beginning, from the definition all the way through the entire process of trying to rate the performance of an organization. And it works very well when it's done properly.
So maybe I can ask you, Skip, just to extend this a little bit more. It sounds like this is a very active process. Managers are very actively engaged in a continual MBO. And so two questions come to mind. One is what's the best way to really stay active with your people to understand that the objectives are really being fulfilled? And the second thing that comes to mind for me is this the ultimate in delegation? I mean, do managers get a free ride here? Do they get to sleep the rest of the time? They kind of say, this is what I want done. And yet these people who are micromanaging have to work pretty darn hard. So what do you think?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of things here. I guess we're not supposed to officially talk about management by walking around, but kind of back to Domingo's point, I mean, you start listening, and if you have the sort of relationship you should with your people, I mean, you start getting vibes right away. Right. And so, just informal, regular communication, at HP, we never had doors on our offices. To this day, I never had a door in my office, and I think I'll go to my grave with that, something I was able to claim. And so, I mean, interacting with your people, being around, seeing what's going on, just talking about it, being part of the team, although being responsible, is really very important. I mean, it's just good to be informed. So one of the other things we did, and this, I hope this isn't a little off topic, is that, we would separate, people's objectives into program objectives and development objectives. So that, and that would be what would come up, for annual review. So some personal things they would be working on and developing their capability, and then the shared, program, objectives we all needed to get done.
Give us an example of what an objective like that would sound. Let's talk about that program objective.
Well, a program objective, would be, to achieve, the manufacturing release checkpoint of a new product that, program manager was responsible for meeting all the, requirements, performance, reliability, cost, volume, ramp, and so forth, by a given date. So very, very clear. And then a development objective, could include something as, mundane as taking a course to, typically it was things like that, to improving in some known area of need, patience or listening skills, softer stuff.
Right. So would that objective then vary significantly depending on what level in the organization this individual was in terms of its open-endedness?
Oh, completely. And of course, going back, I stopped being a manager 12 years ago. I mean, I had, managers managing managers. And so that's why, I'm thinking in terms of what it looks like when you're directing or managing a program manager, and a couple levels below that, they're managing engineers, which isn't something I haven't done for over 30 years.
Right. So Domingo, earlier, I think you said that some of the benefits of this were that both the employees and the managers are going to benefit. What would you say to somebody that says that this is a cop-out for a manager? Basically, they're turning over the objective and absolving responsibility.
Yeah, well, I think that it's all about perspective, right? I mean, if I really believe that an employee is capable of doing the job, and I set them up for success, then the employee will both be able to achieve the objective and be able to grow in the process of doing so, right? Stretching enough, but not stretching too much. So I think that perspective is, well, from my humble perspective anyway, it doesn't seem like it would be very healthy, because I think if we don't articulate what it is that we're trying to achieve, is basically like ignoring the very famous statement that says, begin with the end in mind, right? So if you don't begin, especially a very complicated program or project, whatever it may be, if you don't begin with that, then I think there's always a chance, there's a higher probability that one can get lost. If I don't know what my final destination is, then I'm going to get lost. I'm sorry, but I need an MBO. What can I say?
Yeah, that's right. So Skip, let's talk a little bit about those people that may not work very well in an MBO environment. Have you encountered situations where people really didn't work very well in that environment?
Oh, sure. I mean, there will be folks who are more comfortable working alone, who are made nervous by, dependencies on other people who like to have it laid out for them, and who, frankly, prefer to go home at a regular time each evening. And, there's plenty of room, in many organizations for people like that, but they probably aren't the people that you're going to be developing as your own replacement or future leaders. So, yes, I guess is the short answer.
So what you've described, I think, is the fact that there is some responsibility on the employee's part if they get the level of freedom that you're giving them to decide how they do their work.
Sure.
Yeah. And some people are not as well prepared to take that up. I do remember one particular case where I walked into a situation where people have been living in a directive environment for a long period of time. And I learned some lessons about change management in that case. So how would you, maybe, I don't know if you've been in this situation or not, Skip, but how would you imagine that you would take a group of people that had been directed for 10 years and introduce something like MBO?
Well, I only have one experience. I didn't do that many jobs in HP. I ran the semiconductor R&D for a long time, and then I ran the inkjet R&D for a long time. But when I made that transition, the personnel director for the inkjet components operation made kind of a big whoop-de-doo about the new R&D manager. The previous one, Frank Klucher, had gone to Singapore, and while he certainly hadn't run a directive environment, the concern was, well, things are going to be different. So the personnel director implemented a process, of the new, manager getting to know, the people, there really wasn't a huge change, but they were careful, to spend some time working on the relationships from the beginning. And my own instincts, of course, were to listen carefully and learn what was going on, lest I misassess and start leading off with mistakes.
Right, right. That makes sense. Domingo, you might have a different perspective on this or a different set of experiences since you've worked other places.
Right. Certainly very similar experiences. So again, as I mentioned to do at the beginning, that I've had the privilege of working in several different cultures around the planet. I've lived I lived for a long time in Malaysia and China and Japan and also in Europe and in the US, and every place has a very different culture. So there is a culture, for example, in certain places where management by directive is more the norm, but you need the team to operate in a more independent manner just because you need the productivity to go up. And I'm talking about real productivity that you can measure in terms of the final bottom line, gross margins. And you can do that even in a culture like that. And I think Skip hit the word that is key in this whole thing. It all boils down to the relationships. And are you able to listen in to see where people are and to visualize where you want to go in terms of the culture? And then how do you go about making that change? Because some people implement cultural changes by doing a drastic change, and other people do it by making an evolutionary change. And I think there are circumstances where you can use either one of those. In my opinion, most of my experiences with making the gradual changes and bringing people to a sustainable operating point so that they can more independently make decisions and perhaps, be more creative about how they do things. You do need that in most cases, actually. So
Right.
That's my experience, is that it works really well when you encourage that. But most of the time you just have to lead by example, and that takes time too, to build that trust, that relationship.
Yep.
Right, right. This certainly this tenet is based on trust and respect for other people, which is our first tenet of leadership as well. And you've mentioned change management, which is a really critical topic maybe for our future. Well, I'd like to thank both of you for joining us here today, both Domingo and Skip. Really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you very much.
Domingo and Skip, thanks very much for joining us here today. Larry, I understand that our next topic is going to be enabling our people. And so I'm looking forward to that here on 10 Tenets of Leadership.